The sheer scale of the Indian election is mind-boggling, with a plethora of parties, thousands of candidates, and of course nearly 1 billion eligible voters. So how does the media provide sensible reporting and analysis of this supersized democratic exercise? Our guest today is the ABC's India correspondent, Stephanie March. She joined me via Skype, and I began by asking her to explain the challenges inherent when covering such a large and complex electoral contest.
Well, it's the biggest democratic exercise the planet has ever seen. 814 million eligible voters voting in 9 different stages over a 5-week period, over a country that has a landmass half the size of Australia, but a population, the size of Europe. So there are logistical challenges, abound in that for both the Electoral Commission and also for reporters trying to cover it. You obviously can't be everywhere. So the biggest polling day, I think, which was a week or two ago, I think it was 122 constituencies going to the polls on that day. So obviously you can't be everywhere, and especially being a foreign news outlet, you certainly have limited resources. So actually knowing what's happening on the ground is really, really difficult. So I've found it's a matter of trying to pick the key seats that are going to be meaningful, and also just what your resources can, I suppose, can stretch to. And I think that's what a lot of the other, particularly Western media, have done as well. They, look at the seats that are going to be the big ones, like Varanasi, where Narendra Modi, who's tipped to be the next Prime Minister, is going to be vying off against the head of this new anti-corruption party. So that's, I think, on the 12th of May. So that's going to be a very popular one. There's also Amethi, which is the sort of, and Raebareli in UP, which is the Congress stronghold. So there are some of those sort of seats which are more meaningful. And in terms of states, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar are the biggest states, and they're not bellwethers, but you need to win a lot of seats in those states to sort of get a substantial and viable majority. But India's, it's such a mix. You've got urban, you've got rural, you've got north, you've got south. So actually trying to paint a picture of what's going on everywhere is really difficult. And you've got regional parties as well as the major parties. So, you just can't generalise at the end of the day, and you just have to sort of give little micro snippets where you can.
And do the leaders of the party try and manage the media the same way they might in Australia, where it'll be tightly controlled around that leader and journalists are expected or invited to then come and travel with that person?
It's incredibly well controlled. So Rahul Gandhi, who's the Congress vice president, who's the next in line, although not anointed as being the prime ministerial nominee, he is only given one English language major TV interview during the entire election campaign process, and it was widely seen as a disaster. He spoke in the third person, he rambled, he didn't get a clear message across, he was quite evasive. It didn't do him any favours, and obviously Congress is already lagging in the polls. Narendra Modi, the BJP leader, he's also had very tightly controlled media appearances. He's done several interviews, or a few interviews in Hindi, particularly with the newspapers, often with favourable media outlets, so media outlets that are known to be sensitive to the BJP and positive towards the BJP. He's started doing a lot more as we're getting closer to polling, the end of the polling period, and analysts, a few that I've spoken to, have said they're so confident now they don't feel that he could stuff up that badly at this point because they're just doing so well. But yes, it's a very tightly controlled thing. You go to any rally in the media and the crowds, there's a buffer distance of about 30 to 40 metres between the leader on the stage and the media and the crowd there. So it's definitely tightly controlled. They're highly inaccessible. The BJP are quite active on social media, which makes them a little more accessible, but the major parties definitely do hold the power when it comes to access.
And we hear a lot, even here in Australia, of the power that the media barons and the media organisations themselves hold. How do they wield that power in an electoral contest?
Well, there's a lot of debate about, there's this thing, the so-called Modi wave. So if you just paid attention to the mainstream media, you'd think that Modi is the Messiah and he's just, popular in every corner of the country, broadly speaking. And critics say that this Modi wave is often just constructed purely by the media. And it's just the fact that they're going to the Modi rallies, not the Congress rallies, So the media is really powerful here, and the media is so vast. There's hundreds of 24-hour TV news channels in English, in Hindi, in regional languages. There's thousands of newspapers, weekly, daily, again, in all the different languages. And most of them do have some, either they're funded by business, they're funded by political parties. There's very few truly independent media outlets here in India. So when they take a stance, they can be very powerful. And a few months ago, there started to be a bit of an exit of some of the senior editors at some of the major media outlets who've been quite critical towards Modi or pro-Congress. So there's a bit of a fear as well among media outlets that, this is an unknown, and should Modi come in and be an authoritarian, draconian leader, it could cause a lot of problems for them. There are a lot of court cases going on in India that involve media outlets, be they defamation or other such cases, which, the court system in India, that can go on for years. But, there's a bit of a paranoia that Modi could come in and speed up some of those cases and make life really difficult to certain media outlets. So there's quite a lot of uncertainty. And having had Congress be in charge for the vast majority of India's independence, it's a real unknown, and a lot of the media outlets are quite concerned. And you could say that that's one reason why there's so much Modi coverage.
And I guess that leads us to the question of scrutiny. In an Australian election contest, there's lots of policy detail, or we can have a debate about how much, but you get some policy detail. Whereas in India, it seems these party manifestos, which are quite broad in their nature, are as close as we get to the policy detail. How can people actually find out information about what these parties propose to do with India?
Well, the manifestos are these, chunky documents about 50 pages long that outline, the government's values, what they'd like to do. Sometimes they go into detail of specific program initiatives, but they're largely just broad motherhood statements, i.e. we plan to create X number of jobs, we plan to invest $1 trillion in infrastructure as per the Congress manifesto. They're completely uncosted, which makes them, quite, I suppose, quite useless if you want to look at it that way. But the other thing is they released them so close to the polling day. The BJP released their manifesto the first day of polling. So, if people were waiting for that to make up their mind, they would have been left, in the dark. So really all people have to go on is what leaders say and what their governance records show. So in the case of the Congress Party, that's, 10 years as the major party in this current coalition government. What have they done for India? And the Congress Party would say they've pulled more than 100 million people above the poverty line. They've increased GDP growth. They've done some, some positive things. But the other criticism is now GDP has slipped back. Jobs are hard to come by. There's rising unemployment. There's still huge amounts of poverty. So that's all people really have to go on. In terms of Narendra Modi and the BJP, he's been the chief minister in the state of Gujarat now for 4 consecutive terms, and that state is perceived as doing very well economically, but critics would say at the expense of development and improving social indicators like housing, health, education, things like that. So, and of course, not everyone in India has lived in Gujarat or been to Gujarat, so they haven't experienced that firsthand, whereas a Congress federal-led government, they have been able to experience. But really, that's all people have to go on. It is, I would say, as you said, depending on how much you trust Australian costings and election promises made in the campaign in Australia, I think there's definitely more substance there than I've seen in the Indian election so far.
Yeah. Look, I wanted to ask you just before we let you go about polling and whether the Indian media and the Indian population are as obsessed with the poll numbers as perhaps we here in Australia are when it comes election time domestically. Do they follow the polls, and are they trustworthy?
They do follow the polls. I would say they're not relied upon quite as much as they are in Australia because they're really unreliable. In terms of telephone polling, it's virtually impossible to get a accurate random sample in India because obviously a lot of people don't have fixed lines. Increasingly, people do have mobile phones, but that is just so complicated in terms of actually finding out where that person resides, what their economic status is in terms of trying to get a random sample. So there's great, there's great concerns there about the accuracy. They ban polling data and campaigning 48 hours before an election polling day, so they don't influence the polls. Interestingly, they do exit polls here, but they don't release the data until after the actual official results come out, making them entirely academic because they don't want to influence the people who are polling in the later stages of the 5-week polling period.
The voting runs over many weeks, doesn't it, the staged voting?
5 weeks, so 9 separate days over 5 weeks. So that's a bit of a challenge there. Interestingly, I have spoken to a few analysts that say in the past polling has shown to favour the BJP and not favour the Congress. So it inflates the number of seats potentially won by the BJP and deflates the number won ultimately by Congress. So that's something that's very interesting to consider in this election, that everyone is predicting this massive BJP win. But should the BJP not get an outright majority and they have to make a coalition, that could be really problematic for them. So yes, polling definitely is something that people are interested in, and all the polls do say that the BJP will be highly successful. The Congress will possibly have its worst result ever. But how much you can trust those polls, you really don't know until the results come out on May 16.
Well, that's right. We'll know just in a few short weeks. Stephanie March, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Ryan.